Alright. Hi, my name is Aksat, and I'm presenting combating antibiotic resistance in E. coli. One of the most prevalent issues that we have in the modern day is the rise of antibiotic resistance, and this occurs when doctors overprescribe or patients misuse antibiotics for treating bacterial infections. And this leads to the necessitation of doctors having to administer second-line and third-line antibiotics, and these can lead to numerous side effects, and eventually we'll even learn about antibiotics that can be used. And so here you can see that over the years, the rise of the number of antibiotics that have been resistant in bacteria in the U.S. have been growing exponentially. So, in my experiment, I wanted to test the efficacy of synthetic antibiotics, in which I used ampicillin and tetracycline, in comparison to natural antimicrobials, including colloidal silver, oregano oil, and antifungal oil, by Bioessence International. So, not only did I test the efficacy of both, I also tested whether in long-term resistance, which one will lead to the most amount of resistance. So I first did this by taking E. coli samples, which were provided by Carolina Biological, and I swabbed those on an agar medium. From this, I put on the antibiotic that was being tested. In this case, in this picture, it's ampicillin. Did 3 trials for each in order to ensure the right test. So I ended up constructing my own incubation tank by creating a heater that was modified to produce a heat of 98.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, to measure the efficacy of each antibiotic, I used a measuring device to correctly chart how large the inhibition zone is. As for the Kirby-Bayer disc diffusion test, you can see that the greater this disc, the greater the zone of inhibition, which will be shown by the disc around the bacteria, that will show the efficacy of the bacteria. It's the antibiotic on the bacteria. So here you can see the data that has been plotted. And so the average effectiveness of ampicillin and tetracycline is about 19 and 28 millimeters. On the other hand, oregano oil, colloidal silver, and the antifungal oil, about 10, 15, and 15.5. So obviously, these are not as effective, and that's pretty predicted. You would expect synthetic antibiotics to work better than natural antimicrobials. However, this is where the second part of the experiment comes in. In my experiment, I pretty much swabbed these inhibition zones of the bacteria from for the bacteria died. Because in these inhibition zones, a few bacteria were able to survive and live on. This is due to natural selection, where these bacteria that had mutations and had the ability to resist bacteria were surviving and left on there. So by swabbing these zones, I was able to pick up only the resistant bacteria and culture these onto a plate, and then tested the bacteria again, getting a new zone of inhibition. I repeated this 3 times, and eventually was able to get a culture that was almost certain to be immune to the bacteria if it was. And so now that I have the final plate, I was able to test and remeasure each of the antibiotics. So for example, the ampicillin, I tested ampicillin again on the exposed lawn. And so by doing this, I was able to measure and accurately see exactly how much resistance incurred. Here you can see on ampicillin and tetracycline, the zone of inhibition went from about 19 to 13 and from 28 to 22.5. And so this shows that there was a great deal of inhibition, with the differences being about 6. But if you look at the natural antibiotics, you can see that there's only a decrease about 2.2, 0.9, and there was no decrease in inhibition zone whatsoever for the antifungal oil. And so this is actually very revolutionary, as this showed that in repeated trials, the bacteria were not able to grow any resistant to these oils. And so the reason why is due to the way that these antibiotics actually kill the bacteria. The way that synthetic antibiotics kill bacteria is that they target the cell, and in terms of binding to the ribosomal units in the cell, and then preventing the synthesis of proteins by the cell. So by preventing the synthesis of proteins, the bacteria cannot reproduce. However, these cells will eventually become resistant, as they will be able to produce enzymes. And so in the final slide, they were pretty much building so much, the growth of enzymes pretty much completely prevented the use of these antibiotics working. However, the way that these natural antimicrobials work is that they, like for example, in the case of colloidal silver, they permeate the cell barrier. In the case of the antifungal oil, they'll permeate the barrier and essentially physically damage or weaken the organelles and the DNA units. And this completely prevents division. And so, although for short-term usage, these antibiotics may be good for actually killing the bacteria, as it was more effective directly, for long-term sustainability, these natural alternatives are much, much more viable in terms of being able to prevent any sort of resistance in the future. So one method that could be used is in conjunction, where antibiotics are used at first, and then one of these products are used in order to kill off any remaining bacteria and preventing you from getting sick from any resistant bacteria. Thank you.
Very good.